The fluorescent light of the hotel bathroom in the Philippines hummed a high-pitched, annoying tune, a stark contrast to the thick, humid silence that had settled between Ed and Rose. Ed, however, seemed oblivious. He was on a mission, a quest for conditioning. He fumbled in his bag, past the travel-sized deodorants and the neatly packed, albeit already wrinkled, shirts. He produced it with a flourish, a large jar of Duke's mayonnaise. He held it up to the mirror, admiring the bold, American label. This was his secret, his hack. Back in San Diego, it was a funny little quirk, something he'd do with his dog, Teddy. Here, in this sweltering room with a woman he barely knew, a woman whose life was so alien to him it might as well have been on another planet, it felt different. But Ed, wrapped in his own bubble of self-assured eccentricity, didn't see the difference. "It's for my hair," he announced his reflection, and by extension, to Rose, who was watching from the doorway with a look of profound, unreadable confusion. He unscrewed the cap. The tangy, vinegary smell of processed eggs and oil immediately cut through the scent of mildew and tropical air. It was a noxious perfume. He scooped out a large, gelatinous glob with his fingers. It was pale, thick, and quivered in his hand. "It's the best conditioner," he explained, his voice echoing slightly against the tile. "Makes it smooth." He lowered his head and began to work the mayonnaise into his thinning, dyed black hair. He massaged it in with a vigorous, almost violent enthusiasm. Globs of it clung to his scalp, dripped onto his ears, and ran in rivulets down his neck. He looked like a man being consumed by a condiment. The smell was overwhelming now, a sour, stomach-turning fog that filled the small bathroom. Rose's face, a mask of politeness, finally cracked. Her nose wrinkled. "It stinks," she said, her voice small. Ed laughed, a short, sharp bark. "It's the vinegar. That's what is the magic." He was now plastering it on, making sure every strand was saturated. He looked up, his face slick with sweat and mayonnaise residue, a grin plastered on his face. "You want to try?" She recoiled, a physical jolt, as if he'd offered her a live snake. "No," she said, and fled the room, leaving Ed alone with his reflection and the reek of 1,000 bad picnics. He just shrugged, perplexed by her reaction, and continued his ritual. He truly, deeply didn't get it. This was him, in all his glory. Why wasn't she charmed? The lack of self-awareness was a chasm, and it only widened. Later, as they sat on the edge of the hotel bed, the tension was as thick as the mayonnaise had been. The air conditioner, which he'd complained about incessantly, wheezed and rattled, doing little to combat the heat. He decided it was time for a real conversation. So, he started leaning in, invading her personal space. "I have a request." Rose looked at him, wary. She'd already endured the interrogation about her past, the thinly veiled accusations, the constant gifting of items that felt more like transactions than presents. "I want you to shave your legs," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a directive, delivered with the casual authority of a man ordering a burger. Her eyes widened. She stared at him, speechless. He mistook her silence for confusion. "Your legs," he repeated, gesturing to his own.
"Shave."
"You know." He made a scraping motion with his hand. I don't like hair. On women." It was the flatness of the statement that was so brutal. There was no, "I was wondering if," or "would you mind?" It was a pure, unfiltered demand. He was asking her to alter her body for his preference, as if she were a car he was thinking of buying, just needing a few cosmetic touch-ups. "My legs," she finally whispered.
"Yeah.
"It's just, it's nicer," he said, trying to sound reasonable. More feminine. The word hung in the air, feminine. He, a man who had just slathered his scalp in sandwich spread, was now seasoned on femininity. Rose pulled her legs up, crossing them defensively. A blush of shame and anger crept up her neck. This wasn't a cultural misunderstanding. This was just rude. It was a man telling a woman her natural body was a problem for him. "You don't like me?" she asked, her voice trembling.
No.
"I like you," he said, backtracking, seeing he'd hit a nerve but still not understanding why. That's why I'm telling you. I want to be open. I want you to be, well, for me. For me. That was the core of it. Everything was an extension of his own needs. Her feelings, her comfort, her dignity. They were all secondary to what Ed wanted. The trip wasn't about meeting her world. It was about seeing if her world could be sanitized, repackaged, and made palatable for his. The list of demands grew. It was a steady, cringeworthy avalanche. He didn't just want her legs shaved. He wanted proof of her purity. He presented her with an STD test request. Not in the privacy of a doctor's office, not after a long, compassionate conversation, but just out of the blue. He wanted her to take a test, to prove she was clean. It's for us, he'd said, holding out the paperwork like a high school permission slip. It's about trust. But it was the opposite of trust. It was a neon sign flashing, I don't believe a word you say. He'd built a fantasy of a season in his head, and now that he was here, he was trying to sand down all of Rose's reality-shaped edges to make her fit. He was terrified of her past, of her poverty, of the very life that had shaped her. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a project. And then there was the moment he met her father. They were at Rose's family home, a place so removed from his San Diego life it was shocking. It was a small, open-air structure, cobbled together behind a larger building. Pigs and chickens wandered freely. The floor was dirt, and the shower was a communal bathing area where her father, a man who had worked the land his entire life, was washing himself with a bucket. Ed's face was a masterpiece of barely concealed horror. He looked around, his nose wrinkling at the smell of the pigs, his eyes wide at the lack of walls. This was not the quaint, rustic charm he'd perhaps pictured. This was poverty. Real, unfiltered, and unapologetic. This is nice, he managed, his voice strained. Rose's father, a quiet man, simply nodded. He offered Ed a dipper of water. Ed, trying to be a good sport, agreed to shower. He stripped down to his swim trunks, a pale, soft figure amidst the rugged landscape. He stood there awkwardly as her father wordlessly showed him how to use the bucket and dipper. The water was cold. The pigs snuffled nearby. Ed tried to make small talk. So, pig farm, huh? The man just nodded, continuing to wash. Ed felt the eyes of the entire family on him. He was a spectacle. He tried to scrub himself, but he just ended up splashing water around, shivering, his discomfort palpable. He felt judged. But what he didn't realize was that he was the one doing the judging. His expression, his flinching, his every guarded movement was a silent critique of their lives. He complained. Oh, how he complained. The heat, the fan, the mosquitoes, the lack of air conditioning. He even asked Rose, "How can you live like this?" It was the ultimate insult. He was a guest in her home, a home she had no choice but to live in, and he was treating it like a one-star Yelp review. He couldn't see the love, the family, the resilience. He just saw what he was missing, the comforts of his privileged American life. He bought her a new set of sheets and a toothbrush, holding them up for the camera as if he were a visiting monarch bestowing gifts upon the peasantry. He thought he was being generous. He was really just being condescending. This pattern continued, a relentless drumbeat of disrespect. When they finally had a moment alone, a chance for real intimacy, he bungled it with an awkwardness that was painful to watch. He leaned in, his face uncomfortably close to hers. "Can I halik you?" he asked, using the one Tagalog word he'd bothered to learn. It was the plea of a middle schooler, not a grown man. Rose, who had by this point endured the mayonnaise, the leg-shaving demand, the STD test, and the insults to her home, just looked at him. The cringe wasn't just in his actions. It was in his fundamental inability to see her as an equal. He saw her as a prize to be won, a problem to be fixed, or a child to be managed. He mistook her hesitation for coyness. He leaned in further. She turned her head. It was a rejection, clear and simple. But for Ed, it was just another puzzle. Why wouldn't she want to kiss him? He was the man who had traveled across the world. He was the one with the American passport. He'd given her a toothbrush. The trip was a disaster, a slow-motion car crash of cultural ignorance and personal arrogance. He hadn't just made a few faux pas. He had systematically, moment by moment, revealed a core lack of empathy. He went too far, not in one single action, but in the relentless accumulation of 1,000 tiny, cringeworthy cuts. He hadn't just visited Rose's world, he had tried to colonize it. And in the end, the only thing he'd managed to do was show everyone, in excruciating detail, exactly who he was. But the Philippines was just the beginning. Back in America, with the borders closed and his first taste of D-list celebrity-induced dopamine, Ed's cringeworthy tendencies didn't fade. They metastasized. He was single and, in his mind, ready to mingle. He re-entered the dating scene with the misplaced confidence of a man who believed his own hype. This led him to Liz, a woman from his local San Diego restaurant scene. The initial meetings were awkward. He would come into the restaurant where she worked, ostensibly for a meal, but really to hold court. He'd sit at his table, his dog Teddy often in tow, and regale her with stories of his fame. He was Big Ed now, a living, breathing meme. He seemed to think this moniker was a passport to any woman's heart. Liz, recently out of a long-term relationship, was vulnerable. She saw perhaps a funny, if eccentric, man. But the red flags, which had been waving furiously in the Philippines, were now giant, stadium-sized banners. Their first date was a disaster. He invited her to a hotel. Not for a drink in the bar, but to the room. The pretense was a nice dinner, but the vibe was thick with expectation. He was clumsy in his advances, deploying the same middle school Halleck energy he'd used on Rose. He leaned in for a kiss, and when she turned her head, he didn't just accept the rejection. He pouted. He whined. "Come on, just a kiss," he'd say, trying to wear her down. She rebuffed him, and the dynamic was set. Their entire relationship would become a painful cycle of him pushing and her resisting, until she finally, exhaustedly, gave in. Then, the moment she did, he would find a new way to sabotage it. He demanded she move in. She was hesitant. He pushed. She relented. The moment she was there, he began his campaign of micromanagement. He didn't like the way she was. He didn't like her friends. He didn't like her work schedule. He was jealous, possessive, and deeply insecure. He tried to train her, as if she were a new pet. This wasn't just in his head, he said it. He wanted her to be a certain way, to fit the mold he had for a partner. And when she, a grown woman with her own life and personality, bucked against this, he exploded. One of their most infamous fights, captured by the ever-present cameras, began over nothing. It was a small disagreement that Ed, fueled by alcohol and insecurity, blew up into a full-scale emotional war. He followed her around their apartment, his voice rising, his accusations flying. "You're not committed," he'd yell. "You don't love me. You're embarrassed by me." The last one was the most telling. He knew, on some level, that his behavior was embarrassing. But instead of changing it, he demanded she simply stop being embarrassed by it. He weaponized his own insecurities, turning them into a club to beat her with. He would break up with her. Constantly. It was his signature move, his trump card. Any time she stood up for herself, any time she drew a boundary, he would declare, "We're done." It was a cruel, manipulative game. He'd break up with her, wait for her to be devastated, and then, a few days later, reappear with flowers and apologies, promising to change. It was a textbook abuser cycle, played out on national television. He broke up with her via text. He broke up with her in the middle of restaurants. He broke up with her, by his own count, nearly a dozen times. Each time, he chipped away at her self-esteem, making her feel like she was the one who was lucky to have him. The cringe reached new heights at the tell-all specials. These were Ed's hunting grounds. Surrounded by other cast members, with a live audience and a host, Ed would transform. He became a preening, aggressive peacock. He deflected every criticism of his own behavior by launching a vicious attack on someone else. He attacked Liz, time and time again. He revealed her deepest insecurities to a national audience. He talked about their sex life, or lack thereof. He called her names. He belittled her. And when the other cast members, horrified, would call him out, he'd play the victim. "You don't know our relationship," he'd scream, his face turning a blotchy red. "I love her. I do everything for her." But the most telling moment, the one that truly showed he'd gone too far, was the phone call. A recording was played. It was Ed screaming at Liz. The vitriol was shocking. It wasn't the funny, bumbling Big Ed of the mayonnaise jar. This was a different person. This was a man filled with rage. "You're stupid," he screamed, his voice raw. "You're a ***king idiot. I'm the best you'll ever get." The entire cast sat in stunned silence. Even the host was speechless. This was not cringe. This was abuse. This was the dark, ugly reality behind the meme. The man who had charmed audiences with his little dog and his mayo hair was, in private, a verbal tormentor. Liz sat there, tears streaming down her face, forced to relive her own humiliation. And Ed? He tried to defend it. "I was drunk," he offered, as if that excused it. "She pushed me. She knows what buttons to press." There it was again. The blame shift. The total, absolute refusal to take responsibility. He hadn't just gone too far. He had obliterated the line. He had shown the world that the cringeworthy behavior was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface was something far more toxic, a deep well of narcissism and anger that poisoned every relationship he touched. He was no longer just a cringeworthy reality TV star. He was a cautionary tale.